Well, welcome to the last week of instruction before the final exam. This week we're going to look at Romanesque and Gothic buildings and some artwork, illuminated manuscripts, and some reliquaries and sculptures from this time period. Here you can see the map of Western Europe around 1100. At this time, Christian rulers are spreading religion throughout Europe. And as a result, what we see are the secular and the religious authorities becoming intertwined. An idea that pops up at this time are monasteries, and it starts to become kind of the center of a European lifestyle and culture. And then the other part that's important during this time period is that we start to see pilgrimages to holy places, Jerusalem, Santiago de Compostela, Rome. Here's a great map showing some of the pilgrimage routes. And you'll notice 4 different pilgrimage routes, one coming from Paris, one coming from Vézelay, one coming from Le Puy, and then one traveling through Toulouse. They all join, and then they become one route as they go through the northern part of Spain, all to Santiago de Compostela. The holy places like Jerusalem, Rome, and Santiago de Compostela received many visitors, and it encouraged the churches along the way to try to acquire religious art and relics. The Romanesque, meaning in the Roman manner, is a term that describes early medieval European architecture. Architecture included solid masonry walls with rounded arches and vaults, much like we've seen in Rome, the round-headed arch. It was a period of great building activity, born from the desire to glory the house of the Lord and his saints, but also to participate in the pilgrimages. The Romanesque style is considered the first trans-European movement. Timber remains common in construction, but Romanesque builders turned mostly to stone masonry for its valuable, durable strength. This particular building, Saint-Sernin in Toulouse, France, was on one of the pilgrimage routes. Travel books were written about the pilgrimage routes so that travelers and pilgrims would have more information about local customs and phrases to use in different towns on their way to Santiago de Compostela. Bad food, poisoned water, bandits, dishonest merchants could impede pilgrims from completing their journey. The author of the travel book, Picard, describes various routes and sites of note along the way. A modern photo, Rick Stevens, if you will. And then churches along the way needed to learn how to accommodate for large groups of visitors. You can tell from this floor plan of Saint-Sernin, Toulouse, with the double aisles. You see the nave going down the center, and then there are 2 aisles on either side. The outermost aisle would have been used as an ambulatory so that pilgrims could come in and stay on the outside of the building to circulate and ambulate around the building to see the different artwork and the relics and where people had been buried. And then they could leave without interrupting a main ceremony that would probably be happening in the nave. As we look at the interior of Saint-Sernin, you see the round-headed arch or barrel vault as it goes down the nave, right through the center, and you can see most of it is stone. You see the complex pilaster strips and then engaged columns as you go down the nave. They tried to get light in here, but because of the thick stone masonry, that light usually is artificial. So candles, and in this case, it's been electrified so that you have light. But this idea of the round-headed arch and then the filling in the ceiling creates that barrel vault. As a pilgrim at Saint-Sernin, Toulouse, you would have walked around the building, and in one of the chapels or side portions of Saint-Sernin, we see this particular sculpture, which is done by the artist Gildunius. It's 4 feet approximately high. Christ is sitting on a throne surrounded by an almond shaped kind of figure frame. And around that, we see the 4 symbols of the evangelist: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. The relief on this is very, very low, so it's not very deep, although in some places it looks like the relief panel has been carved into to make it a little bit thicker. Here's Sainte-Foy at Conques, another pilgrimage church, much smaller than Saint-Sernin-Toulouse, but we start to see very typical kinds of things, and we start to be able to read the exterior of a building so that we know what to expect when we walk inside it. So here at the west, we have 2 large towers. That would be our main entrance, and then we would walk in down the main nave. It looks like there's a single aisle on either side. When you come to the section that's crossing, that crossing is called a transept, and on top of that we have a crossing tower. Pretty apt name for what's going on. And then beyond the crossing tower in the nave, we would have the apse and the altar. At Sainte-Foy, we do have a reliquary of literally Sainte-Foy, or Saint Faith. This reliquary is done in gold, silver that is gold leafed. It has jewels and cameos over a wood core. And inside the little door that you see a little quadrifoil, 4 little sections right in the center. There's a little door that has, wrapped up in drapery, part of the relic. The church decided that every altar required a relic. And so owning and displaying relics from well-known heroes of the church enhanced the prestige of a community. Theft of relics occurred often, called as a holy robbery, and new owners argued that the saint had communicated to them that they were to be the new owners. But this idea of, along my pilgrimage path, I'm going to stop at Sainte-Foy of Conques so that I can see the reliquary and be in touch with the saint. Here's the floor plan for Santiago de Compostela, or the Cathedral of St. James. This was the chapel, or the cathedral that everyone was headed to along the pilgrimage routes through France and then across northern Spain. This plan shows a simple 1-aisle church on either side of the nave, but notice that goes all the way around, so it is referred to as an ambulatory, all the way around, down the nave, around the transcript, toward the back of the apse. You can see the 5 radiating chapels on the apse, and then you can come back around the other side. A drawing of the Cathedral of Santiago de Compostela. Here we can see the west towers. You see the double towers. You see the crossing tower in its octagonal shape. Beautiful transept going across that, with radiating chapels not only on the apse but also on the transept radiating arm. When you come inside of Santiago de Compostela, you notice that it is a barrel vault, but look at how they've played the gray local stone off the white of the roof in the barrel vault, using a plaster to be able to get that look. So you're looking down the nave and you'll notice that it has 2 stories. The bottom story called the nave arcade, that's the ground floor, and then we have a second story that is kind of an upper gallery. The Cathedral of St. James in Santiago de Compostela is admired for its architecture and its construction. Pilgrims were arriving here every week after months of difficult travel, and it is particularly important for this church to be impressive, not only because it is the burial of St. James, but also for the awe that it would inspire as you walked into it. This is a cutaway view of the church at Cluny. Cluny had an independence that the Pope in Rome had allowed. It is part of a monastery, and the monastery was a city unto itself. Approximately 200 monks observed the traditional Benedictine hours, of which there are 8 of the divine offices. The churches were notable for their fine masonry. This is a representation of the third church at Cluny. At 550 feet long, this rebuilt and made it larger each time, completing it in 1130. The church was a basilica with 5 aisles, so a main nave and 2 aisles on each side, indicating 5. And then it has the transept, the crossing arm, also an ambulatory and radiating chapels around the back of the high altar. Here's a drawing of the city of Cluny, and you can see the Cluny 3 from the back of the church, where you can see the ambulatory and the apse in the back. Romanesque churches had great portals or main entrances. So this slide indicates the voussoirs, or the parts of the arch. It has the archivolts, which often are sculpted. You can see the half circle tympanum. You have the lintel over the door, which is supported on both sides by the jambs, and often you have a trumeau in the center of the lintel. Let's look at a couple of these from different churches that are Romanesque around France and Spain. Here's the south portal of Saint-Pierre at Moissac. The sculptors carved speaking facades, if you will, on Romanesque churches. Christian messages were on display in public spaces. Here at Saint-Pierre, there's a powerful image of Christ in majesty that is right in the center of this tympanum. And then around it, you see different flowers and ornaments that cover the archivolts and other sections. Here, Christ is surrounded by 24 elders. And as you look at the eyes and the faces of the 24 elders, you can almost draw lines from one eye to the other and where they're going. And they all seem to be looking toward Christ when you get there. Their legs are crossed differently, which makes it a little bit interesting. You also see across the lintel, you see the continued use of the rosette, but notice that they're not evenly spaced. And that tends to be a little bit typical of the. Here we're looking at the right side of the trumeau from Saint-Pierre. The trumeau features a pair of lions and the prophet Jeremiah, skillfully conforming to the shape. The side walls of the porch and the front of the portal are filled with other figural sculptures. Subjects convey human frailty and attempt to persuade viewers to follow Christ's moral teachings. As we go inside at Moissac, we see both the cloister and we also see an historiated capital. These surround the cloister, and the historiated capitals, usually they're sculpted to tell us different stories and teach us different morals. The cloister was used as an area for meditation and quiet reflection and study. It is surrounded on 4 sides with kind of a covered area or porch, and then there are entrance points to get into the center, which usually would be open to the sky and would have trees or grass, often benches, where the monks could go and meditate. Let's go to a different church now. This is the Church of Saint-Lazare at Autun in France. Again, a different pilgrimage route, but here showing in the tympanum is showing the Last Judgment. Christ is in the center, surrounded by an oval almond shape, and then on his right side, Christ's right side, our left, we see those that are going to be saved and judged to be worthy to go to heaven, and on his left or our right, we see a scale, and we see the devil weighing the hearts of people and the souls of people to see if they're going to hell or not. So here in the Last Judgment, and again, remember these are at the front of the church. And so we need to be able to show people the benefits of coming into the church and being a member. Christ is shown as dominating this figure, and so again we use that term hieratic scale, which we've been using since the Egyptians. Here is that Christ figure. You can see a little bit more clearly, and you can see how his hands are both out. Standing, you can see his skeleton. Notice that his legs are kind of splayed, and you kind of see the kneecaps and a lower bone. But it is not the naturalistic Christ that we are worried about, but we are worried about the symbol that he is, the bearded judgment, the lawmaker here at Otan. Here are some details from around Otan, these coming from the historiated capitals. Here we see the hanging of Judas, and then we can see other stories from both the Old and New Testament. And again, these are on the capitals as we circulate around the church and often around the cloisters. Here's another church, La Madeleine from Vézelay, France. Again, center of the tympanum is Christ. And Christ here is talking about the Pentecost and the mission of the apostles. So at this point, after Christ is resurrected, he's gone for a while and then he comes back according to the New Testament to talk to his apostles and prophets, and he sends them out on missions to teach the Gentiles and the Jews. This is surrounded by other figures in the archivolts and by signs of the zodiac and emblems of people around the world, and the journeys that the apostles would go on. Again, this is a billboard, if you will, about the benefits of being part of this church. So we move to Germany. There are many different things that we can see. We learned during the Ottonian time period of the idea that the Germans really liked towers, and we see them not only in the west but also on the east, and we see the major crossing towers. Here at the Speyer Cathedral, we're looking at the apsial end, and so we can see the high altar area, and you can see the towers on this east side. When we go into Speyer, we're looking east at this point, looking down toward the apse, but we're in the nave. And again, you can start to see the height that these buildings are getting. And if you look carefully, you'll see not only the nave arcade, but you'll see kind of a painted area. Then you'll see the gallery where you see lights and you see windows right there. And now it looks like there's even a third story above, and in the center of two arcade pieces, we see one more window giving us a third story and more light to be able to come into the church. One of the things about these compound piers where you see lots of columns kind of bundled together, that we know that these were done so that the squareness of a pier wouldn't overwhelm the people, that they could kind of look around a corner. And if you look into the ceiling, it's no longer just a barrel vault. It actually is called a groin vault. You'll notice that from where the arches go across the nave, you have those two heavy round-headed arches. But if you look carefully, you'll see kind of a very faint X. And what's happening is the nave is crossing at a right angle where the window is coming across, and what that does is it creates an uplift on the ceiling, and it's called a groin vault. If we move to Italy, the Romanesque looks a little bit different. We see still towers, but the towers are not attached like they are in Germany. We also see kind of a low, squatty, if you will, church. This is the Church of San Ambrogio in Milano. And you're standing in what is called the atrium. So here in Italy, the other thing that happens is we tend to keep copying the Roman house. And Roman houses had gardens and open roofs at the beginning. You would walk into the house, you'd have this open area where you could wash your feet in a fountain, and then you would walk into where the family was. So this atrium area, instead of being a cloister on the side where it was a place of meditation, is more kind of a place of gathering. You're looking also at the narthex of the church, or kind of a porch before you get to the main church. When we go inside of San Ambrogio, now instead of just having that faint X where you can see it, you start to see the use of this marble going up and actually lining where the crossing is occurring. So you have two barrel vaults that are crossing at 90-degree angles, and the intersection of those two creates that groin, which here is highlighted by the red stone going toward the center of the ceiling. Here we have the Cathedral of St. Mary of the Assumption at Pisa. The maritime power of Pisa decided that they needed a new cathedral, and they built it in Mary's honor. The exteriors in Tuscany are very richly decorated with marble. Sometimes we see white marble, sometimes we see red and green also as accents. But this is not just the cathedral, it is a complex. The first building that we come to is the baptistry. That's the circular building. And then we approach the cathedral, which you are seeing from the west end, and you notice the three doors. And then you can see the crossing tower right above. And then beyond the cathedral, you see what's called the campanile, or the bell tower. And the bell tower, in this case, is the leaning tower. Now look carefully to the left of the slide, past the baptistry. You can see just the faintest idea of a white wall, and that happens to be where bodies are buried. So because Pisa is near the water, we don't bury down too deeply because of the water tower, so a crypt was made. And so creating as a wall and also a place for burial is a crypt that runs along the left side of this complex. Here's the Leaning Tower of Pisa. Unfortunately, the ground is not as stable here. But if you look carefully at this, you will actually see an attempt for the architects to start to bring it back. They were hoping that by the weight bringing the tower back toward the right of our screen, that they would be able to compensate for the sink. But it's not successful. UNESCO has had to come in and do a lot of work here at the Leaning Tower of Pisa. And of course, it's a major highlight of people. We hope that they have arrested the steady decline over the years. It has continued to lean a little bit more, and we hope that we do not lose the campanile or bell tower. Moving away from the water, more inland, but staying in Tuscany still, we move to the city of Florence. Here at Florence, we see a baptistry. This is the baptistry of San Giovanni or St. John, which would be typical John the Baptist. If you look very carefully, you'll see one door has been done in bronze to the left, and the one on the right has gold leaf. The one on the right, Michelangelo called the Gates of Paradise. The sculptor Lorenzo Ghiberti did this in such a way that Michelangelo said no one could do finer sculpture than him, and clearly this would be recognized as the Gates of Paradise. There's a great history, so don't forget to take the Renaissance, where you'll learn a little bit more about these doors at the Florence Baptistry. But the construction of the building is clearly Romanesque. Look at the round-headed arches and the heavy use of masonry. A Romanesque sculpture that I think is important, not because of its building, but merely because this is a piece that influences Michelangelo. We know that he travels to Modena to see this cathedral and to see the sculpture here, in this case, the creation and the temptation of Adam and Eve. So you see the story starting on the left, and then you see the creation of Adam. Then you see Eve being taken from Adam's rib, and then you see the temptation where Adam and Eve have already eaten because they already have fig leaves and are covering themselves and their nudity. So this particular panel is important because we think it may have influenced Michelangelo's choice of what to do on the ceiling at the Sistine. Let's move back to France and go north along the coast and the English Channel. Here in the city of Caen, we see the west facade of Saint Etienne or Saint Stephen. Brilliantly done with the two large towers on the west. We see the round-headed arches of the entrance, three different entrances. So we assume that we have a three-aisle church, a main nave, which is a little bit wider that we can read from the front, and then two side aisles. And when we go inside, this is exactly what we see. But look at the ceiling now. Now we have, instead of just an X, we have a six-part groin going up there so that we can raise the ceiling even more. Again, you're looking at 3 stories, but look at the advantage of what's going on here with the third story is now not just a small window, but much larger light and window. And so we're getting a lot more light coming into this. And as the architects will try to go up with this and bring more light into the building, we will move into what's called the Gothic. But Saint Etienne is kind of one of those pivotal pieces here, with its very, very Romanesque round-headed arches following all the maintaining all of the masonry in the heavy wall. We can see it's a very simple church, no transept to speak of here, but still an ambulatory so people could get around the main nave without interrupting services that were going on. As we move across the English Channel to England, here we see the floor plan for the Durham Cathedral. Notice that everything starts to get a little bit more square and rigid as we move into England. And that's pretty typical. We start to see less curves. We don't see the radiating chapels that we've seen all over France or even in Germany. But we start to see very straight walls. And as we look at the interior of Durham, we see a beautiful use of alternating round column and then combination column or bundled pilaster strips. This is an A, B, A kind of construction as we move down the nave. The cross section that you see shows the aisle church that we would go through, and then you start to see that there's an arch on the outside of the building that is acting as a buttress, and then the heavy walls are supported of the second story are supported by that buttress. But instead of having thick walls, that buttress allows us to get a little bit more light into the building. I love Romanesque illuminated manuscripts. It's just so clever. Here you see a capital R, and we've got a knight that is fighting a dragon. Notice that the knight is being supported by a squire of his own who helps to kill the dragon. The knight comes up and has his sword raised, and the dragon then creates the other part of the R. And so we have this beautiful use of color and very clever arrangement of the main characters to create this letter. We also see different stories. This one of Hildegard, who put herself in a small chamber between the nave and the outside aisle of the church and stayed there. And then she wrote about the visions that she received. And so the fire that you see coming down, enveloping her head, is inspiration, or the fires of heaven, if you will. And then there was a small window so that the monks could come to Hildegard and she could pass out the things that she was writing. And so you see her writing on a tablet. Here's another R. Love this one as well. But notice here that something different is happening. Rather than just using the figures to create the letter R, we actually are seeing a scene. Something's going on inside the negative space of the letter. And so this is a real clever use of what goes on. And so we start to refer to these as historiated letters, especially when they start to relate specifically to the writing that they are talking about. Here's a piece, and now we don't need a letter at all. We can just show the scenes. And so here we see Moses at the top showing the law of Moses, or the commandments, if you will, and is lecturing to the children of Israel about that. This folio comes from the Bury St. Edmunds Bible, which is now housed in Cambridge. But notice the beautiful blues and greens. Most of these colors, as it was true for the Carolingian and the Ottonian time period, come from plant-based coloring, except for the green. And then we see them painted on vellum, which is a parchment, which is an animal skin. What a great piece. Here, the scribe. We've seen Matthew before, and we saw kind of the development of Matthew through the Anglo and Hiberno-Saxons. But here, Matthew, no, we don't have to just have Matthew, we can have a scribe. Notice that the scribe has a tonsured head. The center of his head is bald, which tells us that this is a scribe or a monk. And he is using both a knife and a quill to be able to write. During the Romanesque, we also have the Bayeux Tapestry. And the story of the embroidery seeks a justification for the acts of William the Conqueror. The Anglo-Saxon nobleman Harold begins the tale as a hero, but betrays his allegiance to William and dies in the battle. In the dramatic narrative, Harold, like Shakespeare's Macbeth, is overcome by lust for power. If you'll look, you'll notice that the tapestry is almost 230 feet long, and all done by hand. Here's another scene with the horses. We tell the story in Latin, and you can see the borders of the animals above and the dead figures below. During the Romanesque, we also have this great example of a baptismal font. And on the outside, if you're going to have a baptismal font, what better story to put it with than the baptism of Christ? So you see John the Baptist baptizing Christ. Christ, while it looks like he has a skirt on, perhaps, it's actually the water rising, and then you see attendants waiting with garments on the side to be able to clothe Christ as he comes out. Notice very cleverly that this baptismal font is resting on sets of oxen. We see 3 in the front together, we see 3 on the right side, 3 on the left side, and there are certainly 3 on the back side, making a total of 12. And the oxen, we're told, are to represent the tribes of Israel. Okay, let's look at the map again. Now we're about 100 years later at 1200. Notice that you still have the Holy Roman Empire, which was started by Charlemagne back in the Carolingian time period. We have the Kingdom of France. And then you'll see the Iberian area, which we will know as Spain soon, is broken up as Castile and Aragon and Leon and Portugal. And then we also have the southern part of Spain that is taken over by the Islamic world. I want to start the Gothic in Paris. This is the Church of Saint-Denis. This is just outside of Paris, the city proper, and in a small neighborhood now. But what happens with the construction of Saint-Denis is very important to what's going to go on. The impetus was the inability to accommodate crowds of pilgrims in older buildings. And the abbot for this area, Abbot Suger, supervised the building of a new west facade, which you're looking at in the picture with a narthex, and then also the choir, which is at the back of the church going around the high altar. And he does this in what will become called the Gothic style. As you look at this diagram, you can see what it's like with the ribbed, so you have the round-headed vaults, and then you have 2 round-headed vaults coming together, and that makes that groin arch. But then, as you look, what we're going to do is we're going to raise the peak of the arch. We're going to make it more pointed or catenary. And when those 2 come together, look at the height that is gained. And now we see the crisp groins on the outside as well as on the inside. The plan for the choir retains features of Romanesque pilgrimage churches, including its semicircular apse. But in this ambulatory, the use of these catenary vaults or slightly pointed arches raises the height of it. And that allows us to, we do the same thing on the windows, and then we can get more light into this area. Abbot Suger wrote about the change that light could have on the pilgrim and on what they were doing as they worshiped. Here is the ambulatory and those radiating chapels that are in the choir area of Saint Denis. And you can see this is all done in stone. Even the webbing between is done with brick. And you can see the height that is raised and the windows toward the back that you can start to now put in. Suger also starts to color his glass. And so now he brings in what is not just light, but the divine light of heaven. Here's another shot of the interior of that choir, and so you can see the use of the stained glass. Abbot Suger masterminded the reconstruction here at Saint Denis, and by describing and discussing the project, he spoke on the debate about the appropriateness of elaborate art in monasteries. He believed that bronze doors should be marveled not for the gold, but for the craftsmanship and the subject matter, much like what we were talking about back in Florence. But here, beautiful, beautiful stained glass windows. And when the sun is moving around this church and the light comes in, it really does transform the interior space. Moving to another Gothic cathedral, this one at Laon, much more elaborate now than Saint Denis. Still, we see the west entrance here, 2 towers. We keep seeing the major towers, even though Saint Denis really only had 1. You see the 3-part doors, so that we look at this exterior and we say, oh, it's got a main aisle and a main nave and an aisle on either side, or a 3-aisle church. When we go inside, you can see the height now. Look at the walls, and you can start to see the nave arcade, the gallery, an area that's called the triforium that gives us a little bit of space, and then the clerestory, or the 4th story of this. Also, look at the ceiling where you can see the 6-part groin vault. Often this is just raising the height. You see the use of the local stone and then the plastered walls to raise and make this beautiful. Also, stained glass is put in here. You can see that at the end of this as you look northeast in this church. Notre Dame de Paris, or the Cathedral of Paris, is here. You're looking at this from the west bank. To the left, you can see the entrance towers, and then you see the long nave ending in a semicircular or apseal ending. And you can see the transept with this beautiful rose window. There's a matching one on the other side. And now you can see the crossing tower, that it is changing its shape here in the Gothic. Instead of being a major part of the building taking masonry and such, it becomes more of a tower and more of an element of the roof. Notre Dame was heavily damaged several years ago by a fire, and they are in the process of rebuilding this church that took over 20 years to build. I like this drawing because it allows you to see not only height of the comparative buildings, but also the transformation of the wall. And so we just looked at Laon, and you can see Laon with the nave arcade. It looked like it was pretty high, but look how much taller Paris is, and that's Notre Dame de Paris. Very interesting in its triforium area. You see that star, if you will, with its with the areas around that. Even copied by Disney when they did the Hunchback of Notre Dame. Go back and look at that video so that you can see that element. And then here we're going to look at the cathedral at Chartres, and you're going to see the height that we get to, the length of the nave, and then the height of the nave. And then we will go to the church at Amiens, And look now that the height of the nave arcade almost takes up 2 stories at Chartres, and then less masonry still that allows now we move the triforium or the gallery, and then we just have the clerestory. So we're going to go through this transition of 4 to 3 to 3, and each time the masons are getting better at raising the height and accomplishing more light and less masonry to hold up the wall. Some of that is accomplished by what's called flying buttresses. Here's we look at the outside at the Chartres Cathedral. You can start to see those flying buttresses. They're supports, but they are not taking up wall space. They're actually coming away from the building, or flying away from the building, if you will, and that allows for a little bit more skeleton of a structure. But we don't have to cover all of those. We can leave them as exterior. As you look at Chartres, you can see the 2 towers. They are different, constructed slightly different times. Here it is from the front side, or the west side, the west facade of Chartres with its 2 different towers and its amazing rose window. You can see the 3-part entry right at the beginning, but that looks like the nave. This is starting to get a little bit more complicated, and it looks like we have 2 aisles on either side of the main nave. Here's that west facade and the 3 triumphal doors. This goes back and harks back to the triumphal entries and the triumphal arches that we saw with the Romans, but now we're using it as the main entrance. Here in the tympanum at the center, you see Christ in an oval shape or an almond shape, surrounded by the 4 evangelists, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, in their signs, the angel, the ox, the lion, and the eagle. And then on one side we see Christ and the Virgin, and on the other side we see an Assumption. Look at all the way around these door figures. We don't have a centerpiece or a trumeau, but we do have jamb figures, and we can start to tell different stories from the Bible. So we look at a detail here with the jamb figures. We can see that they have crowns on, so these are kings and queens that come from the Old Testament. So we look at the plan of Chartres. We do see that we do have a main aisle and then just a singular aisle on either side, even though it looked like we were going to have 2. But then look at that crossing. The crossing is not so dramatic, but it is almost as large as the whole nave. And then you see 2 entrances, one on either side of that transept, and we're going to have beautiful stained glass windows on either side of that. And now look at the size of the choir. Now we do get 2 aisles or ambulatories moving around the back of the high altar. And so we do now, the front didn't look like it was a 2-aisle church, but it did. And now we can see that as we go past the transept. Beautifully done and then decorated and flooded with light. Here's just looking at the interior of Chartres with increased height and increased light. The stained glass windows at Chartres are absolutely fabulous. We see deep blues and beautiful reds, and then also the whites. This particular one, we're looking at stonemasons and sculptors as they are doing details for the cathedral. These cathedrals became the center of all the creation of the town, and so all the great masters would be coming to this and wanting to contribute. Here's the rose window, and the lower lancets is what those called, those 5 lancets at the bottom, from the north transept at Chartres. Again, you can see, even if you can't see the figures, you can see the beautiful blue and reds that are used in these stained glass. Now, the rose window was usually over the west entrance, but here at Chartres, both the north and the south have entrances, and therefore rose windows. It's a beautiful way to bring more light into the building, especially here at the transept. So it would go across the transept, and just beautifully done here, continuing to tell the stories of Christ, Christ's passion, and then other stories from the Bible. If you notice to the left and right, there are 4 small windows that are red and blue. with some gold. And those windows actually show us that the patronage of the Valois family was here at Chartres, because those are the colors and the symbols that would be associated with that family, which is where the Louis, the kings of France, come from. Great jam figure as we move to the south transept on the outside. The west transept is done much earlier, and as we move, we start to see figures that are not just contained in a column, but you can see here with St. Theodore that his elbow and his arm and his staff get to move without that, so that they're not as constrained. A little bit more life to the figure. Still not contrapposto or using any of those beautiful terms that we've seen with the ancient Greeks, but definitely telling us a story and giving us more information about the body. And it looks like he does have the sculptor does have an understanding of what the human body is doing underneath that drapery, although we still have some ways to go, moving away from the two-dimensionalness of the medieval. Here also, on the south transept, we see on the St. Martin, St. Jerome, and St. Gregory, who becomes the Pope, we can see here beautifully done. Again, they are kind of in that column stage, but they have little crowns or little churches above them that kind of give us information. They hold books and then have sayings and scrolls, so that we can identify them. But again, it's this idea, these are the jam figures, but they have a little bit more emotion. They're not all the same, and they're not as contained in a cylinder as we saw on the front or west portal. Finally, let's get to Amiens. That's the fourth of those drawings that we saw earlier. And here you can see the beautiful west rose window of Amiens, but now look at the tracery or the stonework that's going on around that. Usually referred to as flamboyant. It becomes less and less, although still in stone. Here the towers are a little bit different just because of age and style, and ability to complete, right, or not be destroyed. Amiens does reach great heights, and as we go inside of Amiens, this is a great shot because it does show you also the roof structure, which would have been done in wood. But again, here we get to this beautiful three-story where you have the nave arcade, and then you have the gallery or the triforium area, and then you have the clerestory. And that clerestory it has lots of height. And then on the outside of the building, you can see the flying buttress with two different arms coming down and then joining the building on the outside of the aisle, being able to help for the outside of this lift. Now, as a pointed arch, the stress actually is where those supports are, where the vault springs, where the arch springs, and then a little bit closer to the top, where the roof structure is going to be and the vaults are happening. That's where we have a tendency to go outward, and so we put the flying buttresses in those locations to add support to those two stressing points so that the arch does not collapse. And then again, you're using the wood framework for the roof structure as we go above here at Amiens. When you come inside, again, look at the amount of light that is here. This is so different than Saint-Denis, where it's low and squatty and dark in comparison to something like this with Amiens. It is very successful, and as the light travels, we see the reflection of the stained glass. I love this picture from Amiens, looking up at the apse and the ceiling structure, and you can see how they've used the ribs. Now, at this point of the Gothic, it is the rib that is holding up that roof, and the webbing is not. Whereas, going back to Saint-Denis, the webbing is all important. But as we figure out the structure and we can get more skeletal, it is the rib that is taking that, and the ceiling really is just a fill. Really has no structural help to any of that. But look how beautifully done those ribs are for the groin vault as well as the crossing ribs. Another beautiful Gothic cathedral is here at Reims Cathedral in France, where many of the kings of France were crowned. This is a beautiful late Gothic piece. Again, we're still having the towers. In the very center, you can see the rise of the crossing tower. Beautiful triumphant arches as you come to do your entrance. We read this building pretty quickly, and it's a highlight of all the things that we're able to do in the Gothic, with the sculpture from the doorways to the jamb figures to the portals to up high above the rose window of the different sculptures of the different priests and kings and apostles and prophets. And when we come inside, look at this the height of this again, as the Gothic continues to increase, we continue to get height. It seems that they're always soaring for that. This is truly a skeletal figure, and the walls and the ceiling are just parts of that, but it's really being held up with the columns, the bundled columns, and the ribs that we see. When you go out to the jamb figures, now we are telling stories. So the first two figures here are the Annunciation. So this is Gabriel, the angel, coming to Mary, the future mother of Christ, and saying, Mary, you're going to be the mother of Christ. And then next to that, we have the next story in the New Testament, which is Mary visiting her cousin, Elizabeth. Mary will be the mother of Christ, and Elizabeth is the mother of John the Baptist. And so we know Christ and John the Baptist are cousins, and so Mary and Elizabeth are cousins, and they greet each other, so that's called the visitation. But again, we start to have different looks, and look at the use of the drapery. It's the closest that we've seen to like a wet drapery technique as we get to the visitation scene. You can see the hint of a knee. You can see the feet starting to poke out. So we're moving away from that Byzantine style, but the figures still are more. They're more Byzantine than they are natural. The drapery is doing a lot of the work, but we're still not convinced. The face and the body need to communicate and work together. One of my favorite Gothic cathedrals is actually this one, which is Sainte-Chapelle, which was the private chapel of Louis. And this is the structure of the building. Actually, there is a basement, but not in this particular church or in this chapel that you're in right now. The upper chapel is really 2 stories. There's a story where there are places to sit, and then there are the stained glass windows, which is the entire clear story. This has so many panels. It tells, starting from the back right corner and moving all the way through the apse and back to the back left corner, it tells the story of the Bible, and is so amazing. The ceiling, there's a lot of gold leaf, and the ceiling is done with the fleur-de-lis of the Valois family, and this would have been just an exquisite chapel. I have been here on dull days. I have been here on bright sunny days. It is an amazing place, and each of the stained glass panels is absolutely fabulous with the story it tells. But the combination of it, when you get this, really just the apsial ending, and that's the whole chapel, you get this amazing flood of light. I can't even express to you the colors that are there when you're there in person. It's a very small place, but it is definitely worth a trip when you are on the Ile-de-France and seeing what is Notre Dame. And you need to walk back into this place and find the Sainte-Chapelle. The gift shop is downstairs in the bottom story, and then you come up the back spiral stairs and you come into this beautiful chapel. During the Gothic, one of the things that develops is what we refer to as the cult of the Virgin. The Virgin Mary becomes very important as the Queen of Heaven, and we have what you're seeing here in this sculpture is what is referred to as the Gothic sway. So if Mary were to actually hold a child like that, she not only has to have her hip all the way out there, but she probably would tip over. And so sometimes you see kind of acrobatics going on, but with Mary being the Queen of Heaven and holding the Christ child who is will become the Savior of the world, This one happens to be at Notre Dame de Paris, or the Cathedral of Paris. But this cult of the Virgin will happen all over. Many of the Gothic cathedrals are actually named after the Virgin Mary or Notre Dame. And so this is just the beginning of that, and we'll see it happen not only in painting and sculpture, but we'll also see it in the naming of churches. Here at Rouen, we have a church. This is one that Claude Monet will go and paint at the Rouen. And beautiful, beautiful late Gothic style, beautiful crossing tower that you can see. It almost looks like it's airy in the way this is done. Again, still in stone, but look at the date on this, 1500 to 1514. By the time this church is done, we have already had people like Robert Campin painting. Giotto has had his career as the father of modern painting. Duccio has already painted the Maesta in Siena. By 1500, we're moving up to the David being done by Michelangelo, and so this is a very, very late piece where the Renaissance has definitely taken over in southern Italy, and in the middle part of Italy with Florence and the Tuscan hills. We've seen an explosion of manuscript illumination and the use of oil paints in the north. And it's just fascinating to me that the Gothic continues to have life and continues to move on. This is a beautiful aerial view of a medieval town. This is the town of Carcassonne in southern France. And you can see from the aerial view, you can see the use of two different rings around the city with medieval walls and towers. And then there's a place in between those towers. Great city, lots of fun things to go and visit, lots of food, very jovial people now. But this is a beautiful location, and the medieval city. You really get a sense of how close the buildings are, and the city planning obviously is not done on a grid here. But Carcassonne is a great place. They do have an interesting museum about the Museum of Torture. That as the witches were being exposed by the Inquisition, there is a torture museum here at Carcassonne that's worth going to see. But in this particular case, you want to see the medieval city protected by the city wall, and in this case, two of them. Manuscript illumination is also still very important during the Gothic time period. We do move away from only monks doing the scriptorium or the making of Bibles, although here you can see down at the bottom two monks that are actually doing the work, although the second one with his small little hat might actually be more reminiscent of a workman. And so we see Blanche of Castile and Louis the Ninth, Saint Louis, up at the top. The leaf is done on parchment, and there's gold leaf, and you see a plethora of the gold. And then that beautiful blue French paint along with the red. And the French are very much known for their reds and blues in ink and tempera. A beautiful piece showing, full page with stories. Here's the great God, creator of the world folio from one of the Bibles. This is done in 1220 to 1230. Again, you can see absolutely identify it as Paris with the reds and the blues, and then that gold leaf, clearly for a royal patron who could have afforded those. And then you see Christ using a compass to kind of measure the vastness of the world. Beautifully done. Here's another beautiful manuscript page. This is from the Psalter of Saint Louis. And you can see the continuation of the red and blue that is just so classic of Paris itself. The green is a little bit more difficult, but it makes sense here because we've got a tree. And notice that you've got kind of a continuous narration thing where you've got Abraham, who is visited by the three angels. He rushes out to greet them and then brings them into his home and then feeds them and makes sure. You can see his wife Sarah in the back, just kind of peeking out on the right side. Interestingly, these scenes, instead of happening in the desert where the Old Testament would tell us that they have occurred, happen in front of Notre Dame, and we can tell that from the architecture that's going on behind these scenes. And kind of a first step toward something that will happen in the Renaissance about people being involved in sacred events. To put this set in Paris would bring it closer to our experience if we live in Paris, and be able to help us understand what that might look like or feel like. And so we become part of a sacred conversation that begins in the Bible, but that helps grow our own spirituality, which is exactly what the stained glass of the cathedrals is supposed to help us do. As we move forward, here's Jean Pucelle, who is now drawing. Look at the sketching going on with these. This is a person that is really starting to understand how figures move. We still have some confusion, but the drapery is moving well. The figures are starting to take space. Although they're a little cramped, they kind of feel like they're squished into a foreground instead of having some background, but surrounded by illuminated, historiated initials and other drawings. This is done beautifully in ink. And we're starting to get some of the deep, deep shadows that go on. And one last piece from France. This is now at Saint Denis. There is a beautiful downstairs treasury where many of these pieces are. But this is a silver piece that is gold leafed or silver gilt. And then if you look at the bottom, or the box at the bottom, you'll see the enamel that's being used. In a cloisonné enamel that shows kind of the Passion of Christ. But here you have the Virgin Mary holding the child, the Christ child. And this piece goes along with the idea of the cult of the Virgin. Again, the drapery is a little bit more extensive, but this is done in a metal, and it is done in the round rather than just the painting. Let's move to England, and let's look at the Salisbury Cathedral. Salisbury Cathedral, the English churches don't really emphasize height as much as they do the length of a church. And here at Salisbury, it's very typically English. It's a park-like setting, and it has an attached cloister, and also a chapter house where the monastery would have been. As I said, look at the length of this English cathedral. The Salisbury Cathedral is extraordinary in terms of how far it is from the front to the ending in the apse. And everything is square. We started to see a little bit of this with Durham, but now we see it kind of coming all the way home in the Salisbury Cathedral. You do see double transepts, which is interesting, but the crossing tower is over the first transept, so probably extended. The church may have started, and then the double transept took over where the old apse was, and then we get a double transept and we continue to extend the church. When you go inside, you see a beautiful, beautiful building. It is extremely long when you're indoors. But look, the groin vaults, the crossing vault, the gallery, the clerestory, the nave arcade, all of this is made so that we can get as much light as we can in this three-aisle church, nave and an aisle on either side. One of the places in England that I think does such a great job with the Gothic is actually at Westminster. And this is actually in the chapel of Henry VII. And we have a different kind of vault. We've had pointed arches that helped us create different kinds of vaulting. But this vaulting is referred to as fan vaulting. And the center of the vault actually comes toward the ground. It almost is kind of like a stalactite that drops from the ceiling. Absolutely fantastic the way these fan vaults are there. And the British, it's typically British, and we see it here in the chapel of Henry VII at the Westminster Abbey. Here's the exterior of that so that you can see, again, the stonework that's going on, and it is just a little bit different, even if you compare it back to where you see the kind of the rose window and the rose and lancet windows. This is definitely a different look on the exterior as well as in the interior. Let's look a little bit at some sculptures. This is Eckhart and Uta. The sculptor of this work created highly individualized figures and faces that don't necessarily represent portrait likeness. They're more ideal. And then these figures are painted. So we talk about polychromy or painting, and we can see that that has survived. The colors have survived into the future. Beautifully done. Again, this kind of takes off from that idea of the jam figure. You can see these fully emerging from that, although they still have kind of the building over them. But this in Germany, beautifully done. Also coming from Germany, we have the Bamberg Cathedral and the Bamberg Reiter. This is an equestrian portrait. We've seen those before. We've seen it with Marcus Aurelius during the Roman time period and Charlemagne when he does it on a small bronze. Now we're getting back to life size. And so we do an equestrian portrait, again covered with the city or the church above the head to kind of create it as a niche. Notice that the horse is part of, he is not completely freestanding, but he is part of almost a relief sculpture. Most of the body is connected, but is still is beautifully done, and the person sits astride that horse in a beautiful equestrian piece, bringing back the glories of Rome. Here in a small 2-foot piece, the Rodigan Pietà. The Pietà is typically a scene that we see in France and Germany, so here being done in Germany. And mostly we know it's German because of the torture of the Christ figure. The crucifixes and the dead Christ are particularly emaciated and gruesome when they come out of Germany. And so here the mother of Christ holds his dead body, but you can see how emaciated it is, the agony that the figure is in, as well as with the scars from being crucified on the cross. And so while we have the cult of the Virgin with the Virgin holding the baby Christ in France, here in Germany we're seeing more of a Pietà style, which is the Mary holding her dead son after the crucifixion.